My mother kept a chair empty at the head of our table for 15 winters, and the night a dead man walked in out of the snow and sat down in it, I was 9 years old and certain I was watching a ghost take its supper. I have told this wrong most of my life, the way a boy tells a thing, all wonder and weather. Let me tell it true now, while I still have the breath, because the man who came down out of the bitter tooth that night was no ghost, and the woman who finally let him sit was the strongest soul I ever knew, and I would not have either of them remembered small. We ran the Cowboy house at Quarry Bend, the last warm roof on the Wishbone Road before the country tilted up into the high cold and quit pretending to be kind. Freight men stopped with us, and packers, and the rare fool bound over the pass too late in the year. My mother fed them and bedded them and took their coin, and she did it alone, because my father had been 3 springs in the ground by then, drowned at the Wishbone crossing the year the snowmelt came down like the end of the world. I do not remember him well. I remember her well. I remember her hands, which were never still, and her back, which was never bent, and her face at the end of a long day, which was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. And I remember the chair. It sat at the head of the long table and no one ate in it. Drovers learned that fast. A man would drop into it, weary off the road, and my mother would set his plate at the bench instead, gentle but plain, and say, "Not that one, friend," and that was the whole of it. She never explained. She didn't dust it special or set it apart with cloth. It was just a chair that stayed empty, the way a grave stays a grave, and I grew up beside it never thinking to ask, the way you don't ask about the mountain out the window. It was simply there. It had always been there. I was older before I understood the chair had a name. His name was Eli Tanner. I learned it the way children learn the things grown people would rather they didn't, in pieces, on the edges of talk. I learned it from the smith, Ot Coyle, who'd been a young man when it happened, and told it like a thing that still sat heavy on him. I learned it from the way the freight man Holly's vein went stiff and ugly whenever the high country came up. And I learned the shape of it finally from my mother, but not until the night I am telling you about, and not in words you'd call an answer. Here is what the town carried, the way a town carries a thing, smoothed and certain from being handled so long. 15 winters before, when my mother was a girl not yet 20 and Eli Tanner was the best hunter in the valley, he and young Will Vane had gone up into the Bittertooth after a string of mules that had broke loose and drifted into the high meadows. It was October, the dangerous month, when the snow lies thick on the peaks but the trails below still look like summer and lie to you about it. They went up together. Only one came down. Eli came down alone, near dead, his hands ruined, and he said the snow had taken Will. "A slide," he said. "Come down off the shoulder of the mountain without warning and swallowed the boy whole," and Eli had dug till his hands gave out and the dark came and there was nothing left to dig for. The town did not believe him. Or rather, Holly's vein did not believe him, and Holly's vein was Will's brother, and grief makes a loud man louder. Holly stood up in the very common room of our way house. It was his father's then, and said Eli Tanner had gone up into those mountains with his brother and come down without him, and that no slide he ever heard of took one man and spared the one standing next to him. He said Eli had wanted the mules, or wanted something, and had left a half-grown boy to freeze. He said it loud and he said it often, and a thing said loud and often becomes the truth in a place small enough. There was no body to argue with. The mountain doesn't give them back till spring, and when spring came the slide had moved and the meadow was just a meadow and Will Vane was somewhere under it, and a man can't be tried for a mountain. So they didn't try him. They did worse. They turned their backs. They stopped buying his furs and stopped meeting his eye, and when he walked the one street of Quarry Bend, the talk stopped where he passed and started up behind him, and a young man can stand a great deal but not that, not forever. And one day in the next October, he packed what he could carry and went back up into the high country, into the very mountains the town swore he'd murdered a boy in, and he did not come down. A year passed and they said the cold had him. 2 years and they said it for certain. After a while, they said he'd been a ghost up there all along, and mothers used him to frighten children off the trails, the tanner that the mountain ate, and that is how I first heard the name, as a thing to scare me, never dreaming the chair in my own house was set for him. Because my mother had loved him. I did not know that either, not for the longest time. I had to grow up and put the pieces in a row. She had been the girl Eli Tanner meant to marry. Everyone knew it back then. Aunt Coyle told me, the two of them, it was a settled thing. Only nothing settled till it's done, and then the mountain undid it. When Eli went up that 2nd October and didn't come back, my mother waited. She was 19. She waited 3 years, then 4, and a way house and a girl alone are a hard pairing on that road. And at last she married my father, Tom Cobb, who was steady and kind and built her the warm rooms we lived in, and never once, that I heard, said a word against the chair she kept empty at the head of his own table. That is the kind of man my father was, and I am sorry I don't remember him better. So that was the country I was a boy in. A way house, a widow, a kept chair, and a story everyone agreed on. I thought it would never change. Children think that. Then came the storm. It blew in off the high country late in November, the kind of storm the old packers called a wolf winter, that comes early and means it. By dark the snow was past the bottom rail of the porch and the wind had teeth, and my mother had given up watching the road and barred the door against it. We had no guests. Even the foolish were not on the wishbone that night. There was just the two of us and the fire and the long, empty table, and she'd set our supper at the bench the way we always ate, the head of the table dark. I remember the knock because it didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like the storm had thrown something against the door, and my mother went still with the ladle in her hand, and we listened, and it came again lower, the way a man knocks when he hasn't the strength left to be heard. "Stay there," she told me, and crossed to the door and worked the bar and pulled it in against the wind. He was on his knees on the porch. That is the first thing I saw of Eli Tanner, a man kneeling in the doorway of my house with the snow blowing in white around him, more snow than man, his beard frozen gray and a great hide cloak white-crusted over his shoulders, and a pack and a long gun and the look of something the mountain had spat back out because even it had had enough of him. My mother did not scream. I want that remembered. A figure out of the dark on a wolf winter night, and she didn't make a sound. She set the ladle down on the floor beside the door, careful as you please, and she went down on her own knees in the threshold facing him, and she looked at his face a long, long time while the cold poured into our warm rooms and the fire jumped, and I watched her, and I saw her change. I have seen a great deal in my years. I have never seen anything like my mother's face in that doorway, going from a widow's hard quiet to something I had no name for, something cracking open after 15 winters of being shut. "Eli," she said. That was all, just the name. And the kneeling man lifted his head and his eyes found her, and whatever the mountains had done to the rest of him, they had not got into his eyes, which were a young man's eyes still, and lost, and afraid of her. And I understood for the first time in my small life that grown people can be afraid in a way that has nothing to do with bears or storms or drowning. "Marin," he said, his voice was a ruin from cold or from not using it. "I had to come down, I couldn't." He stopped. The cold had him shaking so hard the words broke up. "I couldn't die up there with it still wrong between us. I tried for 15 years to be content to die up there. I couldn't do it." And my mother, who had not let a soul sit in that chair in all my life, took this snow-crusted ruin of a man by his ruined hands. I saw her flinch when she felt them, felt what was wrong with them, and she pulled him up out of the doorway and over her own threshold, into the warm, into the light, and she half carried him to the head of the long table, and she set him down in the chair. The empty chair, his chair. I have thought about that moment more than any other in my life. Not the knock, not the storm, that. The way she kept a place set for a dead man 15 winters and never said why, and the way, when he came back not dead, she didn't make him stand in the doorway and account for himself, didn't ask him first where he'd been or why he'd left or whether the awful thing was true. She put him in the chair. She gave him the warm before she gave him the questions. I didn't understand it then. I think I have spent my life trying to be worthy of having seen it. Then she turned to me and her voice was almost steady and she said, "Jesse, bring the kettle and get the gray blanket off my bed." So I did, because a boy does what his mother says even when a ghost is taking supper. And that is how I came to be standing close enough to see his hands when she peeled the frozen mitts off them by the fire. I had never seen hands like that. They were a brave man's hands made of scars. The fingers were short, 3 of them on the one side ended too soon in old healed stumps frostbite took years before. The skin was ruined and white and dark by turns, the nails gone or grown wrong, the knuckles huge. They were hands that had been frozen and thawed and frozen again, more winters than I'd been alive. Hands that had clawed at the world and lost. And when my mother held them in her own to chafe the life back into them, she was crying, the tears running down without a sound, and I had never in 9 years seen my mother cry. "What happened to your hands?" she said. And he looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else, and he said, "Digging." That was all he could say that night. The cold and the 15 years in the storm had used him up. My mother fed him broth a spoon at a time the way you feed a sick child, and she banked the fire high, and she made him a bed by it, and when he slept, he went down all at once, mid-word, the way the badly spent do. She sat beside him in the firelight with his ruined hand held in both of hers, and she did not move all night. I know because I woke twice and crept to the loft rail and looked down, and twice she was just so, watching his face like a woman watching to be sure the tide didn't take something back out that it had finally brought in. In the morning the storm had blown itself stupid, and the world was white and silent and impossible, and Eli Tanner was still there, asleep by our fire, and he was real. He stayed 3 days before the town knew. The pass was shut, and no one came up the wishbone, and in those 3 days I watched my mother and the mountain man circle each other in our warm rooms like 2 creatures that have forgotten how their own kind moves. He could hardly use his hands. That was the worst of it to me. As a boy, this big weathered man, plainly strong, who couldn't button his own shirt, couldn't hold a cup but two-handed and careful, couldn't do the small things. My mother did them for him without making it a thing. She'd lace his boots and he'd look away, his jaw working, his pride a live coal in him, and she'd say, "Easy, you laced mine often enough once, I recall." And the coal would bank a little. Slowly over those 3 days, the story came out of him, not in a flood, never that, but in hard pieces dragged up one at a time, mostly in the dark after he thought I was asleep. He had not left WildWest to die. I want to set that down plain, because the town carried the lie so long it grew bones. They'd gone up after the mules, the 2 of them, that long ago October, and Eli had read the snow on the high shoulder and known it for what it was, a slope loaded and waiting, and he'd told the boy they'd go around, take the low cut, leave the mules if it came to that. A mule wasn't worth a slope like that. And WildWest, who was 17 and certain the way only the young and the doomed are certain, had laughed at him and gone up the short way alone while Eli was lashing a pack, gone up onto the loaded shoulder after a mule, and the mountain had done what a loaded slope does. Eli heard it come. He'd been below, on the safe line, and he heard it let go above him with a sound he said he still heard most nights, and he had gone up into it instead of down out of it, up into a moving mountain after a boy, which is the act of either a fool or a man who can't do otherwise, and he dug. He dug with his hands because the shovel was lost in the first second. He dug in the dark and the cold long past when there could have been anything left to find, dug till his hands froze to claws and stopped being hands, dug till he passed out in the hole he'd made and woke and dug more. He showed us. He held up the ruin of his fingers in the firelight, and his voice was very flat. The way men go flat over the worst things, and he said, "These are what I have to show for how hard I tried to bring that boy home, and they called me a murderer. They looked at these hands and called me a man who walked away." My mother said, "Lo, I never called you that." "No," he said. "You never did. That's why I couldn't come back, Marin. The whole town I could have outlasted. I'd have stood in the street and let them talk till they got tired. But you," he stopped. The fire popped. "You believed me, and there wasn't a soul up there to say you were right, and I couldn't drag you down into being the fool who took the murderer's side. I thought if I left, you'd be free of it. You'd marry some good man and forget the whole sorry business. I thought I was doing the one kind thing left to me." "You thought wrong," my mother said, "and there was 15 years in it." "I know that now," he said. "I knew it the first winter. By then it was too late to be anything but proud, and the high country's a fine place for a proud man to rot." He looked at his hands again. "I'd have died up there, Marin. I'd made my peace with dying up there. Then this fall I found a thing, and I knew I couldn't." "What thing?" she said. And he reached, awkward, two-handed, into the pack at his side, and brought out a small oiled bundle, and worked it open against his knees with those clumsy, ruined hands, slow, while we waited. And inside was a knife with a bone handle and a scrap of hide gone hard with age, and on the hide, scratched with a knife point in a boy's rough hand, were words. "Spring," Eli said, "the slide gives things back, always has. I've been finding Will Vane for 15 years, a piece at a time, as the mountain lets him go. A boot, the mule's bell, and this fall his knife, and under the knife wrapped against it like he knew this." My mother took the hide scrap and held it to the firelight and read it, and her hand came up to her mouth. The boy had written it dying, or thinking he might. The hide was a mule's hobble, the words gouged shaky and deep, went up the short way. Eli said no, not his fault. Tell Hollis. W.V. He'd lived a while under the snow then. Long enough to know whose fault it wasn't. Long enough to try, with a frozen hand and a knife point, to send the truth down the mountain to the brother who would spend his life hatting the wrong man. And the mountain had held it 15 winters, and then, this fall, with no reason but the slow turning of cold and thaw, given it up into the ruined hands of the one man it could clear. "I couldn't die with that in my pack," Eli said. "It wasn't mine to take into the ground. It was Hollis's. It was yours." He looked at her, and his young man's eyes were wet. "I came down to give it back. That's all I came for. I'd no right to come for anything more than that." My mother sat a long while with the boy's last words in her hand. Then she folded the hide closed, careful as scripture, and she set it on the table, and she put her own 2 whole hands over Eli Tanner's 2 ruined ones, and she said, "You came for more than that. You can lie to a mountain for 15 years, Eli Tanner, but you'll not lie to me at my own fire. Say what you came for." And the big man bowed his head over their joined hands and could not say it, and didn't have to. And the fire burned down low while neither of them moved, and I lay very still in my loft and understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and forever, that my life had changed in the night and would not change back. On the 4th day, the pass opened enough for a man on snowshoes, and the news of it went down to Quarry Bend ahead of anything we could do, because Ot Coyle's boy had come up the wishbone to see where we snowed dead and had seen, through the window, a strange gray-bearded giant sitting at the head of the Widow Cobb's table in the chair, and had run the whole way back down to tell it. By noon there were tracks coming up. By the time they reached us there were 6 men, and at the head of them, of course, was Hollis Vane. I was afraid of Hollis Vane the way children are rightly afraid of a man with grief gone sour in him. He was big and gray and hard-handed, the freight and the store both his now, half the valley in his ledger, and he had spent 15 years being the man who was wronged, and there is no man harder to face than one who has built his whole self on a wound. He came in without knocking, which my mother allowed no one, and he stopped 3 steps inside the door when he saw who sat at the head of the table, and the breath went out of him like he'd been struck. "You," he said. Eli Tanner rose. It cost him. His legs weren't sound yet either. But he rose and stood and faced the man who'd hounded him out of the only home he'd had, and he said in that ruined voice, "Hollis." For a moment I thought there'd be killing in our common room. The men behind Hollis had rifles, and Hollis's hand was at his hip, and the air had that taste. My mother stepped between them, between Holly's and Eli, into the open ground where the trouble was, a slight widow woman in an apron, and she said, "There'll be no guns in my house, Holly's vain. You'll hear what he's come to say, and then you'll do as you see fit. But you'll hear it first." "I've heard his lies," Holly said. 15 years ago, I'll not hear them twice." "Then hear your brother," my mother said. And she picked up the hide scrap off the table and held it out to him. "I will tell you the truth. It did not go easy or quick. Holly's vein did not read 4 lines of a dead boy's writing and weep and embrace the man he'd hated. A wound that old does not heal at a touch. It has grown into the shape of the man, and to lose it is to lose part of himself, and that is a terror." He took the hide and looked at it, and his face worked, and the first thing out of him was that it was a trick, that Eli had scratched it himself, that no man could prove the hand. But Ott Coyle had come up with the rest, and Ott had known Will Vane the boy had taught him at the forge, and Ott took the scrap and looked at the letters a long time and said, "Quiet. That's Will's hand, Holly's. I'd know it anywhere. Look how he made his V's. The boy never could make a V, and it was such a small, true, human thing, a brother who couldn't make his letters straight, that I saw it go into Holly's vein like a blade, the realness of it, the boy himself reaching up out of the page." Then Eli held up his hands. He didn't say anything. He just held them up into the gray light from the window, the ruined claws of them, and he turned them over slow, and he let the men look. "You all decided what these were," he said. 15 years ago. You decided they were a guilty man's hands. Take another look. These are the hands of a man who dug into a moving mountain after your brother Holly's. And didn't stop till there was nothing of me left to dig with. I've carried what you called me a long way. I'm done carrying it. Will told you the truth himself. Now you know it. Do what you want with me." And Holly's vein, the hard man, the wronged man, the man who'd built 15 years on his certainty, looked from the ruined hands to the boy's gouged words and back, and something in him that had been clenched so long it had forgotten it was clenching, let go. He sat down, right down on the bench, heavy like his legs were cut, and he put his face in his big hands, and he made a sound I won't describe because it isn't mine to give away, the sound a hard man makes when the thing he's leaned on his whole life turns out to be a lie, and there's nothing under him anymore. My mother went to him. To Holly's, mind you, to the man who'd hounded the soul she loved out of the world. She put her hand on that bowed gray head and she said, "He's been under your snow a long time too, Holly's. Let him down now. Let him rest." I didn't understand then that she meant Will. I do now. It was a long afternoon, and I'll not tell all of it. There was no triumph in it which surprised the boy I was. I'd thought the truth coming out would be a grand thing, bells and shouting. It wasn't. It was quiet, and it was hard, and it left everybody smaller and more honest than they'd been. Holly's vein didn't ask Eli's forgiveness that day. That came later, years later, and is its own story. But before he went back down the wishbone, he stood in the doorway and turned and said, rough, not looking at him, "You'll have your furs bought in my store same as any man, and anybody says otherwise to me will answer for it." Which from Holly's vein was a thing close to weeping, and Eli took it for what it was and nodded, and that was the start of the long mending between those two. Then the men went down the mountain, and our rooms were quiet again, and it was just the 3 of us, which I did not yet know was a number I would keep. That evening my mother cooked a true supper, the first since the storm, and she set 3 places. Not the bench, the table, and when it was ready she stood behind the head chair, his chair, and she put her hand on the back of it, and she looked at Eli Tanner across the warm room, and she said, "I kept this empty 15 winters. Some of that was grief, and some of it was spite, and a good deal of it, I'll own, was just stubbornness, keeping a thing the way it was because the way it was the last way I had you." She drew a breath. "I won't keep it empty any more, Eli. I'm too old and too tired to feed a memory. But I'll not have you sit in it as a guest either, here a winter and gone come spring back up that mountain to die proud. So you'll tell me now. Are you down for good, or are you down to say goodbye?" She had asked him, you understand. Not begged, not waited, not hoped. asked plain on her own ground with her own terms laid out like cards. My mother never in her life let a thing be decided over her head, not the chair, not the way house, not her own heart. She would have him or she would not, but she would do the choosing, and she would make him choose too, out loud, like a grown man, and live by it. And Eli Tanner crossed the room to her slow, and he stood in front of her, and he raised one ruined hand and laid it against her face, that hand that couldn't button a shirt, gentle as gentle, and he said, "I'm down for good, Marin, if you'll have a man who can't lace his own boots." "I've laced them 4 days running," she said. "I expect I can manage the rest of my life." And she turned her face and kissed the broken palm of his hand, the part of him the mountain had taken, the proof of everything, and that is where a boy looks away even when he's grown into the man telling it. They were married in the spring, when the pass opened, by the circuit preacher in our common room, with Ot Coyle standing up for Eli in half, the valley crowded in, and Holly's vein in the back, come of his own will, which my mother counted the truest gift at the whole wedding. Eli Tanner took us both, my mother and me, the dead man's boy that was no blood of his, and he never once made me feel a stranger in it. He couldn't do the small things with his hands, but he taught me everything a man can teach with words and patience: how to read snow, how to set a line, how to know weather, how to go up into high country, and more important, how to come down out of it. He gave me the only thing my own father hadn't lived to give. I called him Pa within the year. He cried the first time, the big fool, and pretended it was wood smoke. He lived 22 years more, down among the warm and the living, in the rooms my drowned father built, beside the woman who'd kept his chair, and I do not believe a day of it was wasted on him. He used to sit of an evening at the head of that table, in that chair, and my mother across from him, and the two of them would say very little, just be there in the lamplight, two creatures who'd at last remembered how their own kind moves, and sometimes I'd catch him looking at her like he still couldn't credit it, like the warmth of the house was a thing he'd been let into by mistake and might be put back out of any minute, and she'd catch him at it and say, "Eat your supper, Eli," and he would. Content as content. The chair sits in my own house now. My grandchildren eat in it, all elbows and noise, and they don't know a thing about it, and that is exactly as it should be. A chair that was empty 15 winters because a proud man wouldn't come down off a mountain, and a strong woman wouldn't stop believing he hadn't done the thing they said, and a dead boy under the snow tried for 15 years to send the truth down to the living. That chair has a right to be full now, of children who will never have to know what it cost to fill it. But I know. I was 9 years old, and I saw a dead man come in out of a wolf winter and kneel in my doorway, and I saw my mother go down on her knees to meet him and put him in the chair and give him the warm before she gave him the questions. And if you ask me what love is, after all my years, not the easy kind, the kind that holds the line a whole life through, the kind that keeps a place set against all sense and all the town's certainty, I'll tell you it is a woman with a steady back and a ladle set careful on the floor, looking into the ruined face of the one she never gave up on, and saying his name like it was the first warm thing the world had done for her in 15 winters. "Eli," she said. And he came down off the mountain, and he stayed,